When I call this one of the most underrated cars in Europe, that is not clickbait. Just look at the strange combination Seat created here. At its core, this is a family MPV, but with all-wheel drive, increased ground clearance, and rugged body cladding. On top of that, it came with a 200 horsepower turbocharged engine and could reach 100 kilometers per hour in about 7.5 seconds. And all of this arrived back in 2007, effectively before the era of mass-market crossovers. This is not an Audi, not a Subaru, and not some expensive premium experiment either. This is the Seat Altea Freetrack, and in my opinion, it is one of the craziest and most underrated cars Europe has produced. To understand where the Freetrack came from, we need to go back to the early 2000s. At the time, Seat was trying to establish its own distinctive identity within the Volkswagen Group. Walter de Silva was responsible for the brand's design, and under his direction, Seat developed a new family of cars with a very distinctive appearance. The first production model of this generation was the Altea, introduced in 2004. It was a compact MPV with an unusually sporty design for its class, featuring a high beltline, distinctive sculpted sides, and a rather interesting front end. Seat even created a separate name for the concept behind the Altea, calling it a multi-sports vehicle, to emphasize that this was not just another family MPV. The third generation Toledo followed. Technically and stylistically, it was very closely related to the Altea, but it received a longer rear section and a huge boot. Then, in 2005, the second generation Leon joined the family. It was a conventional hatchback, but used the same design language, including the distinctive sidelines and hidden rear door handles. In 2006, the range expanded again with the longer Altea XL, offering more interior space, a larger boot, and a very sad-looking rear end. In just a few years, Seat had effectively built an entire family of very different models around the same visual identity. At the same time, in the mid-2000s, crossovers were rapidly gaining popularity across Europe and the rest of the world. Many buyers were moving away from traditional saloons, hatchbacks, and estates. For urban drivers, genuine off-road ability often mattered very little, and plenty of crossovers were available with front-wheel drive only. But the higher driving position, more rugged appearance, and sense of versatility were proving extremely attractive, and the segment was growing rapidly. Seat had no model of its own in this class, while a proper crossover was still some way off. But the company had no intention of ignoring such a fast-growing segment. So Seat found a much quicker and more unusual way to enter it by using the newly introduced Altea XL as the starting point. That was how the story of the Altea Freetrack began. But simply turning the Altea XL into another SUV imitation would not have made much sense. Seat had neither an off-road reputation nor the experience to compete directly with established crossovers. And the idea of an off-road MPV was not new either. Back in 2000, Renault launched the Scenic R X4 with increased ground clearance, plastic body cladding, a spare wheel mounted on the rear door, and permanent all-wheel drive. Mechanically, though, it remained a fairly modest family car. The most powerful petrol version had a naturally aspirated 2-liter engine, producing 140 horsepower, and reached 100 kilometers per hour in around 12 seconds. Seat decided to take the same idea in a very different direction. The future of Freetrack was developed at the company's technical center in Martorell, and the first result was presented at the Geneva Motor Show in the spring of 2007. Visually, the Altea Freetrack prototype looked much more extreme than the production car that followed. Ground clearance was a massive 310 millimeters. The body was widened by 60 millimeters. It sat on 19-inch wheels with chunky tires, and the spare wheel was mounted directly on the rear door. But the most interesting part was underneath. Instead of an ordinary family MPV engine, Seat fitted a 2-liter turbocharged TFSI, producing 240 horsepower, the same engine that had recently appeared in the Leon Cupra. It was paired with a 6-speed manual gearbox, while power was sent to all 4 wheels through a Haldex all-wheel drive system. The result was not simply a raised MPV with plastic cladding, but effectively a mixture of a family MPV, a hot hatch, and a crossover. The production Freetrack appeared just 3 months after the prototype and differed from it considerably. The most obvious changes were the large, unpainted bumpers and plastic body cladding. The spare wheel disappeared from the rear door. The wheels became more modest, and the ground clearance was reduced to more reasonable levels. The production Freetrack was slightly less extreme. The Cupra's 240 horsepower engine did not make it into production, but the initial engine range was still impressive. The 2-liter TDI diesel produced 170 horsepower, while the 2-liter TSI petrol engine produced 200. Both versions came with all-wheel drive. The petrol Freetrack reached 100 kilometers per hour in just 7.5 seconds and had a top speed of 214 kilometers per hour. For this type of car in 2007, those figures were almost absurd. To put that performance into perspective, it is enough to compare the Freetrack with much more powerful and expensive cars from the same period. A 218 horsepower BMW 525i reached 100 kilometers per hour in roughly 7.1 to 7.7 seconds, depending on the transmission. A 231 horsepower Mercedes-Benz E280 needed around 7.3 seconds, while the 210 horsepower Audi A6 2.8 FSI took around 7.9. In other words, a raised family seat covered in rugged plastic cladding could accelerate at roughly the same pace as 6-cylinder executive saloons from Germany's 3 major premium brands. Interestingly, the public initially responded to this unusual combination surprisingly well. In Spain, both all-wheel drive versions cost the same 29,900 euros, and Seat expected to sell only around 250 cars during the remaining months of 2007. In the end, more than 700 were sold, almost 3 times the original forecast. The press also quickly discovered that the Freetrack was more interesting than it looked in photographs. Not everyone liked the styling, but journalists praised the limited body roll, precise steering, and surprisingly car-like handling. This was especially true of the petrol version, which felt much closer in character to the Volkswagen Group's hot models. Nobody really considered the Freetrack a proper off-roader, and it was never trying to be one. Its natural environment was more likely to be a snowy road to a ski resort, a rough dirt track, or wet grass than serious off-road terrain. It was a car for someone who already needed family practicality, but was not yet ready to surrender to a slow and boring family car. In a way, it was a GTI for someone who now had children, bicycles, and a boot full of luggage. But Seat understood from the beginning that not every buyer needed 200 horsepower and all-wheel drive. So the range was expanded with a 140 horsepower diesel, including a front-wheel drive version. At first glance, that seemed to contradict the whole idea of the Freetrack, but in reality, it predicted the direction the crossover market would soon take. Many buyers mainly wanted extra ground clearance, a more rugged appearance, and a sense of versatility. All-wheel drive was no longer essential. The Freetrack cost noticeably more than the regular Altea XL, but the difference was still reasonable. In Spain, an Altea XL with the 170 horsepower diesel cost around 25.2 to 25.6 thousand euros, while the Freetrack with the same diesel or the 200 horsepower petrol engine cost 29.9 thousand. So for a few thousand euros more, buyers received all-wheel drive, extra ground clearance, different styling, and richer equipment. The first serious decline came in 2009. Against the background of the global financial crisis, Freetrack sales fell from around 3,000 cars a year to just over 1,000. But the model survived the blow, and after the facelift, it received an even more powerful 2-liter TSI producing 211 horsepower, combined with all-wheel drive and a 6-speed DSG. By 2011 and 2012, sales had recovered to around 2,000 cars a year. But in 2013, they collapsed to roughly 770, and in 2014 to fewer than 500. And this was not simply because the entire Altea family was getting old. The regular Altea and Altea XL together sold around 23.6 thousand units in 2012, and still managed around 18,000 in 2014. The Freetrack, by contrast, had almost completely lost its niche. By then, the market that the Freetrack had once effectively anticipated had changed completely. The Tiguan, Qashqai, Yeti, and dozens of other models had turned compact crossovers into one of Europe's major vehicle classes. Crossovers were also developing a more distinct identity of their own, while the Freetrack increasingly looked like a regular MPV that had simply been given a rugged appearance with plastic body cladding. In that world, there was less and less room for something as unusual as the Freetrack. What is especially interesting is that almost 20 years later, the Freetrack still has not become a cult car. It is rare, especially in the more powerful petrol versions, but that rarity has had very little effect on its value. In Europe, 200 and 211 horsepower all-wheel drive cars can still be found for around 3 to 6,000 euros, often for roughly half the price of a Golf GTI of similar age and power. That is exactly why, in my opinion, the Freetrack remains one of Europe's most underrated cars. Against a backdrop of endless Golfs, BMWs, and other cars that have long become a familiar sight on European roads, it still feels genuinely unusual. And behind that unusual appearance is a genuinely powerful and fast car, with performance that very few people would expect from something like this. Perhaps the best indication of how I feel about the Freetrack is that I have been checking listings for one from time to time for several years. Now I just need to find a good example with an automatic gearbox, and in the right color, preferably yellow or red.